Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to present our paper at this nice conference. My name is Engla Ling, and I'm a PhD student in my second year in Stockholm, in Sweden. And I'm presenting our paper that we wrote, me and Robert and Matthias together, called Systematic Literature Review of Information Sources for Threat Modeling in the Power Systems Domain. I have learned that research articles have very long titles, so this is exactly the same. I wanted to start off by saying that the power grid doesn't really look the same today as it did a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, it was fairly easy to secure a power system from cyber attacks. But nowadays, it's not only this power station, as we can see on this picture, but now we have smart meters and we have power plants that are taking wind currents or water currents and producing energy from this. And it's becoming a really complex environment. We also have the part here when it comes to cyber warfare, because now it's the best way to cripple an infrastructure of a country is actually to shut down their critical infrastructures rather than sending off soldiers to fight on that land. So essentially what I'm saying is that power systems are vital for our modern society, and it's extremely easy nowadays to find different loopholes for getting inside. And how do you even find an overview? How do you find out what are the different security risks for your power system? One way of doing this is to create threat models. And with threat models, we can see the potential vulnerabilities, the potential ways that we can actually exploit a power system. So in my research, we are creating these threat models. And I was struck by the issue of trying to find information to build these. Because that's also an aspect of the power systems domain, that these are critical infrastructures. These companies are not willing to share all of their information freely. Oh, look at this, we have a vulnerability here. It's different in the IT industry. Here we have this almost like culture of sharing vulnerability information with each other, and that's common now. But for the power systems domain, it's still very tightly kept secrets. What are the actual vulnerabilities? So I wanted to have a systematic literature review where I would find out what are the different information sources that are being used to create threat models in the power systems domain. Looking at threat modeling, there's different ways of how to represent the threat model. And the ones that we're usually using in my research group are these sort of attack graphs. So I wanted to explain a bit more about what is an attack graph and what are the information that we're looking for in able to create these attack graphs. Typical attack graph, we have the goal of the actual attack at the top. This is the node. And here's the power outage. That is what this attacker is trying to have as the end goal here. And then you walk this tree up to that end goal. And you will have different vulnerabilities that might be in an AND gate. So you have to find a vulnerability and also gain network access. And then you can also have OR gates. So you can either do physical damage or you can do a cyber attack to create this power outage. And you can see that there's also percentages there because we are very interested in what is the likelihood of the different attacks. Because as was mentioned briefly before, it's also about budgeting when it comes to cybersecurity. Should we put a lot of effort and money into protecting ourselves with component A or B? Well, it depends. Where do we want to put our money depending on the highest risk? So in threat modeling, we generally want to know what are the different vulnerabilities, what are the different attack steps, so the paths that an attacker can take inside the network, what is the likelihood of the attack, and then also the time taken for this attack. So this is actually a lot of information that we want to find out before we can create our threat models. And I didn't really find a clear-cut way of doing this. I was looking at different threat models randomly and seeing that they had a lot of different information sources. And that's why I decided to do this systematically and find out what is actually happening in the research industry, what are people actually using, and what could I potentially use in my research as well. So that is a little bit of an introduction of why I created or recreated this paper and wanted to find out this information. I wanted to point out one related work that we had in this article, just to showcase that there has been similar work being done, trying to find a different information, but that there is also a lot of differences. For example, this related work, they found mainly expert opinion, well, only expert opinion and historical data to be their information source for creating threat models. And as you will see from my results, I found something completely different. I found many more different kind of information sources. And the people that wrote this paper, they focused on SCADA and risk assessment. There's also a difference between risk assessment and threat modeling. In risk assessment, you may not necessarily have a threat model to represent the risks. You can do this in a mathematical way, for example. And then, of course, SCADA, it's for ICS, but it can also be used for different systems. And I chose also to focus on power systems specifically. But interesting to be able to compare what they found to what I ended up finding. So I created a systematic literature review, and the systematic part of it is that I had very specific keywords, and I had a very specific method of doing this literature review so that it could be repeated in the future, so that it could be verified, and also to not be subjective, because it's easy, I think, for us researchers to just stumble across papers and then have a collection of, let's say, information sources. But in order to stay objective, I wanted to do a systematic literature review and simply see what I found, see what was actually out there. So I decided to go with attack graph, attack tree, and threat model, with threat modeling and models being, because of the asterisk, different version of it. And then also going power system, energy system, power grid, smart grid, a lot of different terms for the same thing here. And it took me quite some time to figure out which keywords to use to have the kind of articles and results that I was looking for, but also not missing out on much. And then I chose some of the top databases that we have, that we use in our research. So the search results that I found looked like this. I searched mainly for the metadata, or as you've also figured out, I'm sure there are different ways of searching in all different databases. For example, Engla Ling, I had to just manually go through all the title, abstract, and keywords. That was a fun 2 days. As you can see, there was a lot of different results from the different databases. And then I also had an inclusion criteria, because I needed to sift through these articles and make sure that they actually included what I wanted to find out. So I decided to look at articles that focus on cybersecurity. There is a lot of threat models and risk assessments out there in the power systems domain that is also looking at, for example, if there's an overload in one of the circuits and things like these, or if there is a natural disaster, so what would happen then? What would be the risk assessment then? I also wanted all the articles to actually include a threat model or a method of how to create one, so it would become very hands-on. And then, of course, in the power systems domain, also mention one information source that was used to create it, because this again is something that I found, that there's a lot of threat models being created where no information source is actually stated. We're just going on what we know from previous and basing it on our common knowledge. So I had 260 articles to begin with, and then I ended up removing all the duplicates, and I had 44 in the end that also withheld all the inclusion criteria that I had. And this was the final result and the main outcome of this paper. There was a definite majority of papers using expert knowledge and previous research and vulnerability scoring in databases. And I have to say that I was surprised that there was no test beds, for example, included in this. I think that there is a lot of test beds being used. We've also discussed it in this conference already, but I don't think that they have created many hands-on threat models now in the power systems domain yet. So maybe that's nice future work to be done. I wanted to go through all of these different information sources that I found and discuss them a little bit more in detail. First one, the expert knowledge. There is a lot of different ways of doing this, and it's also not very well described in the papers what expert knowledge they used. This could be simply sitting down and having lunch with someone from the industry and picking their brain. What do they think are the most important vulnerabilities, or what is the biggest risks in the power systems domain, and then using that information to create a threat model. So it's very easy to use this information source. As you can see, there was many people that used it, and it can easily be modified, but it's also very difficult to verify, and it's different to make it in a systematic and research-friendly way. There was a few of them that used logs and alert as an information source, and from these papers, they all had different logs that they looked at. So again, there was a wide variety. Some people used the intrusion detection system logs, some people had the historical logs, event logs, and they also had a lot of different information available to them. You could, for example, create your own logs by having testbeds, but you could also gain logs from an actual power systems vendor that's available. So a lot of information is available here, but it takes a lot of time as well to process this. But one potential information source that can be used. Previous research, maybe the most familiar one, the most easily accessible. You simply look at what's been done before. What are the information in the research industry right now saying which vulnerabilities are most important or exist for the power systems domain? And of course, the positive aspects of using previous research is that it's peer-reviewed. We already can validate those results. Tricky thing is that it's difficult to validate the actual information that's been used in the threat models created. I found when going through these papers that they would often refer to papers as a foundation for the threat models, but not necessarily exactly what they use for those papers. We also have this issue in threat modeling that you might find a value for this specific operating system in a specific system using a specific protocol, and maybe not necessarily exactly what you want to model. So there's a lot of generalizations being made and assumptions being made as well. So you might base it on previous research, but it's difficult to validate exactly how well that research is to apply it to your actual threat model. Some of the papers also use system state to create their threat models, and some of the different ways they did this was to even look for evidence of attacks. For example, there could be files left from the attackers. And they could also simply look at what are the firewall's configurations. Is there a firewall in place at all? And then they just use this information to create a threat model. But this requires a lot of knowledge to know exactly, okay, if you have this firewall, or if you have these ports closed, these applications disabled, is that then secure, and how secure is it? For vulnerability scoring in databases, many papers use this because it's readily available information, and it's also already systematic, right? It's quite easy to go through these databases and find information. But as Joe was talking about earlier, he has a paper coming out now where they are claiming that CVE is not very reliable, which is quite interesting to me, because that's also one of the reasons I found this literature review worthwhile, is because we assume that we can use vulnerability scoring in databases to create our threat models, but can we actually trust them? Are they trustworthy sources? And there is a lot of different kinds of these both scoring systems and databases, so I thought I would just run through them in case anybody in the future is looking to do threat models. You'll know as well what your choices are. One of the most common ones is the CVSS, and this is a categorization of vulnerabilities that's used. And what you do with the CVSS is that you actually input your own opinion of how difficult an attack is, for example, if a tool is already available to exploit a vulnerability, and so on and so forth, and it gives you a value. it gives you a scoring value that you can then use in your research. So that's one way of saying that one attack path is more or less likely than another, so you can simulate attacks properly. CVE, as I mentioned, is another way of getting information about vulnerabilities. And this is maintained by different CVE numbering authorities. And this can be literally almost anybody that has an interest and wants to contribute. So they will find different vulnerabilities and they will report these then to MITRE. Another one is the Common Weakness Enumeration, CWE. And the point of CWE was to categorize the different CVEs so that you could educate, you could have some format to speak about these vulnerabilities for the networks, to be able to share the information as well. This is one of the very important aspects, to be able to share this information so everybody becomes aware of the vulnerabilities that exist in the power systems domain and any other domain for that sake. There are some vulnerability databases that exist that also these articles used to create their threat models. You have the NVD, you have MITRE's one, and you have the ICS CERT one. And they use these different CVE, CWE, and CVSS in different variations and forms. So definitely a lot of information out there in these databases, but then the big question is it reliable? Can we actually trust this information that is out there? The last information source that I found while doing this literature review is vulnerability scanners. And there is a lot of them out there. I also know that one of the people presenting later on in the conference is also doing a lot of work with vulnerability scanners and comparing them for the ICS domain. And of course, you get a lot of data when doing vulnerability scanners, but it also requires a lot of setting up. And as we discussed in the breakout room, you might not want to set up a vulnerability scanner in your domain, in your ICS domain, because if something breaks, if you accidentally flood messages, there's very horrible consequences of power systems being shut down. So we need to find good information sources to be able to create threat models for our power systems. This is definitely one of the best ways of being proactive about vulnerabilities and cyber attacks that's happening. And we know that they are increasingly happening in the future. And of course, as any systematic literature review, there are things that could be improved. There's different keywords you can use, different databases you can use. So I'm happy to hear any input from you in the audience. But as an end result, as a conclusion, these are the 6 different information sources that I found that have been used previously in the research. And if I were to, I am most definitely creating threat models in the future. And I think that I'm going to choose a combination of the most common ones. And hopefully be able to include test beds, which I agree is a good source of information as well here, and create threat models based on that. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.